Title: How Medieval Nuns Brewed Ale Better Than Monks, the Boring History for Sleep. Script: Let us begin quietly, somewhere along a dusty medieval road in the heart of 12th century Germany. The bells have tolled for prime, and the sun is only just peeking through layers of mist as you wander toward the stone-walled sanctuary of a Benedictine convent. You expect silence, perhaps a prayer, a hymn, but instead, you're greeted by the hum of busy hands and the earthy aroma of warm, yeasty air. In a low building tucked behind the cloisters, women in coifs and scapulars are tending to large wooden vats. They stir, they strain, they sniff and sample. And here, unbeknownst to most modern drinkers, lies a forgotten truth of brewing history. Nuns, pious, disciplined, and methodical, were some of the most reliable brewers in the medieval Christian world. Ale, after all, was not simply a drink. It was nourishment, hydration, medicine, and sacrament. And while monks have long enjoyed the spotlight for their refined brewing practices, especially in Belgian Trappist circles, the story of the brewing nuns has quietly fermented, mostly untold, in dusty records and monastic ledgers. To understand why nuns brewed, you must first appreciate the role of ale in medieval society. Medieval water sources were rarely safe. Contaminated with human and animal waste, unfiltered water could carry dysentery, cholera, or worse. Ale, however, was boiled during the brewing process, effectively killing off harmful bacteria. Even small ale, a low-alcohol version often brewed from reused grains, was safer than water and consumed daily by children, laborers, and the elderly. Ale was food, in liquid form, filled with calories, nutrients, and protein. For monasteries and convents, it was a staple for both internal consumption and charitable distribution. In some houses, monks and nuns were allotted several pints per day. Nuns might receive a bit less than their male counterparts, not due to lesser need, but because their work was deemed less physically taxing. Of course, this assumption didn't account for the rigorous labor many nuns performed, especially those involved in brewing. Monastic rules, particularly the rule of Saint Benedict, emphasized self-sufficiency, humility, and hospitality. A Benedictine or Cistercian house needed to sustain itself. That meant growing food, baking bread, producing manuscripts, and brewing ale. The nuns, especially in Northern Europe, were responsible for much of the practical labor within their communities. In larger convents, specific sisters were assigned to brewing roles. The servitiaria, or brew nun, took charge of malting barley, maintaining yeast cultures, tending fires, and organizing rotations to stir the mash. It wasn't just necessity, it was precision. Brewing required attentiveness to timing, temperature, as guessed by touch, ingredient ratios, and seasonal variation. Nuns, who were literate and mathematically trained in the context of manuscript copying and liturgical calculations, were often better record keepers than the monks. Their brewing logs were precise and enduring. Take, for instance, the Benedictine convent of St. Gall in Switzerland, or the Frauenkloster in Bavaria. These weren't small, cloistered cottages. They were economic engines, producing not just ale for their sisters, but for pilgrims, travelers, and even local lay communities. You may wonder, why not just call it beer? The truth lies in the timeline. During the early and high Middle Ages, most monastic ale was brewed without hops. The bitterness we associate with modern beer hadn't yet arrived in full force. Instead, brewers used a mixture called Brewed, a blend of herbs such as yarrow, sweetgale, mugwort, and wild rosemary, to flavor and preserve the drink. The use of Brewed gave each region's ale a distinct character, based on the herbs available nearby. For the nuns in woodland-rich Bavaria, this meant fragrant, piney brews. For those on the flat plains of Flanders, Brewed might include more marshland herbs. It was only in the late 13th and 14th centuries that hopped beer began its rise, particularly in German-speaking regions. Hops were bitter, yes, but they also had strong preservative properties, allowing ale to last longer, a feature prized by merchants and innkeepers. Still, many religious houses held onto their traditional, hopless brews for decades. Despite their central role in monastic economies, the nuns' brewing work rarely appeared in illuminated manuscripts or official histories. Most records survive through practical documents, grain ledgers, procurement lists, kitchen logs. In some convents, brewing equipment was passed from sister to sister, often with instructions scratched into the margins of other texts. These were working recipes, not decorative. A brewing vessel might be engraved with marks measuring out the wort's expected froth line, or the name of a sister who had perfected a particular fermentation. Unlike the monk brewers, who occasionally penned treatises or received posthumous fame for their techniques, the nuns worked anonymously. Their ale was judged by its clarity, taste, and nourishing strength, not by any attribution to its maker. But local oral traditions survived. In Saxony, tales told of a black-veiled brewer, whose golden ale was said to heal upset stomachs. In the Tyrol, travelers avoided the local monk's brew, preferring the nuns' clear cup of morning fortitude. These legends, gently whispered, rarely made it to parchment. With success came scrutiny. As some convents began selling ale beyond their walls, tensions arose. Male clerics, and later municipal authorities, fretted over the visibility and independence of these women. Brewing, after all, was profitable. It required negotiation, accounting, and contact with laypeople. By the 13th century, some diocesan bishops issued restrictions on convent brewing. Others tried to place the brewing under external male management. Still, in the countryside, far from episcopal eyes, the nuns brewed on. There were also health concerns. Brewing in the convents meant hauling heavy barrels, working near fire, and spending long hours hunched over mash tubs. Sisters documented scalds, back injuries, and respiratory troubles caused by barley dust. Yet they carried on because their ale fed the community. As brewing became increasingly regulated and commercialized in the 14th and 15th centuries, many convents ceded production to secular brewers. But some carried on into the Reformation era, and even beyond in secret. A few modern microbreweries, inspired by monastic traditions, have begun reviving the recipes of these silent brewmasters. But very few know the truth of their origin, the legacy of the brewing. Nuns, these careful, precise, often overlooked women, has evaporated like steam rising from a warm vat on a cold morning. And yet, if their ale was once the lifeblood of 1,000 quiet communities, step quietly now into the 13th century. The convent gardens are still fragrant with mint and wild thyme, and the brewing house smells just as rich as before. But something has shifted. The ale still bubbles, but murmurs are beginning to stir beyond the stone walls. Murmurs of change, oversight, and reform. The nuns who brew now live in an increasingly watchful world. As cities grow, trade routes widen, and male brewers organize themselves into formal guilds, monastic women must defend their roles in what is becoming a regulated, even contested, trade. And yet, for 2 more centuries, they hold their ground, barrel by barrel, batch by batch, quietly innovating in the shadows of cathedral spires. To understand why brewing endured for so long among nuns, you must see it as more than just a craft. Brewing was a devotional act. The rule of Saint Benedict, though spare in specifics, framed labor as prayer. Idleness is the enemy of the soul. Therefore, the brethren ought to be occupied at certain times in manual labor. This directive applied just as much to women as to men, and for nuns, brewing offered a perfect outlet for both discipline and ritual. The brewing process was often organized around the monastic day. Barley was malted during the quieter early hours. Mash was boiled during mid-morning, when the warmth of the fire could be shared by the kitchen staff. Fermentation began at sext, midday, the turning point between labor and reflection. Even the yeast, called godesgoed in some English convents, was seen as a living gift, bubbling with divine purpose. There are records from English Benedictine convents indicating that prayers were said over the brewing mash, especially when it was meant for medicinal or sacramental use. In the nuns' calendar, feast days often required special batches, sometimes darker, richer alesh made from new grain, harvested in summer, or sweeter brews flavored with herbs like betterny and hyssop. Though these alesh were rarely named or branded, convent recipes were transmitted within sisterhoods over decades, sometimes centuries, subtly shifting with available ingredients and knowledge. By the 14th century, however, the brewing world outside the convent walls was changing rapidly. In cities like Ghent, Bruges, and Cologne, brewing had become a male-dominated commercial enterprise. Brewers' guilds, initially informal, now issued charters, organized apprenticeships, and lobbied for local protection. And they had a vested interest in who could brew, how much, and for whom. This meant that even the modest brewing operations of convents began to draw attention and suspicion. One major issue was grain. As urban brewers sought reliable supplies, grain shortages became politicized. Cities often required religious houses to purchase their grain through municipal channels, reducing their independence and raising costs. Some convents responded by growing their own barley and wheat, or bartering directly with nearby farmers. Others discreetly partnered with lay families to distribute their ale under different names. Grut, too, became a point of tension. The right to collect, mix, and sell grut herbs was often held by local authorities or noble families, and convents were sometimes required to pay fees to access the ingredients they had long gathered freely. This intrusion into ancient herbal practices was both spiritual and practical. It challenged the sisters' traditional autonomy. Yet some nuns adapted. In the Rhineland, convents quietly began experimenting with hops, which were cheaper, easier to store, and not controlled by the same local monopolies. Though the transition was slow and patchy, it marked a quiet revolution in nun brewing, one that mirrored the broader shift in European tastes from ale to hopped beer. In records from 14th-century English diocesan courts, we find curious traces of brewing disputes involving nuns. One notable case from 1374 describes a bishop in East Anglia reprimanding the prioress of a small convent for excessive brewing, specifically, for selling ale at the nearby market during feast days. The prioress defended her sister's actions by pointing to the long tradition of offering food and drink to pilgrims and the poor, but the court was unmoved. The convent was fined, and the ale barrels were confiscated. Another set of letters from France tells of a group of Cistercian nuns who continued brewing after their abbot ordered them to cease. They did so, apparently in secret, brewing by night, distributing barrels through a sympathetic village priest. The correspondence drips with both admiration and exasperation. Admiration for their diligence, and exasperation that such firm and godly women would prove so difficult to regulate. In these moments you glimpse something rare: resistance without rebellion. These nuns weren't challenging the church or even male authority directly. They were preserving a tradition, quietly, diligently, persistently. Their tools weren't swords or sermons, but spoons, scoops, and stirring sticks. Behind all this lies a deeper truth. Brewing was profitable. Many convents were small, their lands modest, their endowments dwindling. Brewing offered a reliable source of income, especially when sold discreetly to inns, hospitals, or wealthier households. Some convents appear in tax records and grain tallies alongside major town breweries. In Lübeck, for example, the Marienkloster nuns were recorded as brewing enough ale annually to supply not just their own sisters, but a local hospice and 2 orphanages. While not large by urban standards, this output was impressive for a cloistered community. What's more, women brewers, both religious and secular, had a reputation for cleanliness and consistency. Convents often maintained cleaner equipment and better storage than their urban counterparts, in part due to monastic rules governing hygiene and order. By the mid-15th century, some nun brewers even experimented with rudimentary branding. Clay jars and wooden barrels were marked with symbols: a cross, a lily, symbol of purity, or initials indicating the convent name. These markings weren't advertisements so much as reassurances, quiet affirmations of a trusted source. And yet, despite their ingenuity, the brewing nuns could not escape the tides of history. The Black Death, 1347 to 1351, devastated many convents, reducing populations and interrupting brewing schedules. Surviving nuns were often too few in number to maintain all their traditional industries, and brewing was sometimes the first to go. Later, the rise of secular female brewers, often widows or unmarried women in cities, provided a different model of female brewing, one more entrepreneurial but also more precarious. These alewives sometimes drew on convent traditions, but operated in a more competitive, male-regulated world. Still, even as convent brewing declined in many regions, traces lingered. An English visitation report from 1449 notes that the ale of the sisters was of remarkable clarity and moderate strength, suitable for fast days. A Flemish bishop's letter in 1453 praises the generous and pious hospitality of the Brew Sisters of St. Agnes, who offered travelers warm ale and oatcakes during Lent. These were not grand declarations, but passing references, signs that the tradition still simmered, even as the world turned. You imagine a nun now, bent over a thick wooden barrel, stirring the wort with practiced hands. Around her, sisters sing the psalms. A cool breeze enters through the high stone window, carrying the scent of sweet gale and dried hops. She doesn't know her work will vanish from history books. She only knows it must be done right, so that tomorrow her sisters will drink something pure. And so the question simmers still, what was lost? Not just in ale but in knowledge, when the last brew-nun laid down her paddle. It is the late 15th century now, and you are walking through a quiet convent garden where the barley still grows in neat rows, but something feels different. The tools are older, the brewing house doors creak on their hinges, and the sisters' voices, once bustling in the brewhouse, now whisper behind stone walls. In this final chapter, the fires of the convent breweries begin to fade, not from negligence or failure, but under the steady pressure of reform, regulation, and reinvention. Here, at the waning edge of the medieval brewing tradition, we trace the last foamy bubbles of an extraordinary monastic craft, one kept alive by quiet hands, dutiful hearts, and barrels that spoke louder than any manuscript. The Protestant Reformation arrived like a wave across Europe in the early 1500s, and with it came a radical reassessment of monastic life. In Germany, where Martin Luther's theses first rang out, entire religious houses were dissolved or secularized. Convents in Saxony, Thuringia, and Hesse closed in succession. Their lands were confiscated, their libraries scattered, their sisters forced into marriage, exile, or silence. For nun brewers, the end came not with a shattering crash, but with slow abandonment. In England, under Henry VIII's dissolution of the monasteries, 1536 to 1541, more than 800 religious houses were seized by the crown. The quiet clatter of brewing tools fell silent in abbeys like Shaftesbury and Barking. In some cases, monastic brewing equipment was sold to local alewives or emerging commercial brewers. In others, it was simply left to rot. While monks occasionally found refuge in universities or became parish priests, nuns had fewer options. Many returned to their families or lived in discreet religious community, forbidden from practicing open devotion. Brewing, once their vocation and economic lifeline, became impossible in a world that no longer supported their presence. But not all was erased overnight. In certain regions, especially Catholic strongholds like southern Germany, Austria, and parts of Flanders, some convents managed to survive the early waves of religious change. These houses often reinvented themselves as charitable institutions or girls' schools, allowing them to continue brewing on a limited scale. One convent in Bavaria, the Kloster Niederskonenfeld, is documented as maintaining a brewery well into the 16th century. The records show reduced output, just enough for the sisters and their pupils, but a continued adherence to traditional recipes. The use of grut gradually gave way to hops, as herb regulation and changing tastes made the old blends impractical. These small operations were often led by aging sisters, the last of a lineage that had passed down brewing wisdom orally. Recipes grew simpler, tools wore down, and the brewing became more about sustenance than craft. It was a slow fading, rather than a sudden extinguishing. The brewing knowledge preserved by these women was, in many ways, ahead of its time. Long before Louis Pasteur, they understood that cleanliness was essential. They rinsed barrels with boiling water, burned herbs to cleanse the air, and stored ale in cool, dark cellars to delay spoilage. They knew the difference between a bad batch and a good one not just by taste but by sound and smell. Some sisters kept small pots of fermenting ale on their personal shelves, starter cultures they used to check for spoilage. These yeast strains, unique to their environments, were cultivated over decades. They also developed subtle methods of quality control. A nun might float a dry bean or wooden sliver in the ale to measure alcohol content by buoyancy. Others used the thickness of foam or speed of bubbling to estimate fermentation progress. But perhaps most importantly, they brewed with a sense of care that modern industrial brewing can only mimic. Their ale was tied to feast days, to healing, to the rhythm of community life. It wasn't just drink, it was ritual, relationship, and provision. By the end of the 16th century, brewing nuns had become ghosts in the archive. Some convents re-emerged after the Council of Trent, 1545 to 1563, which reinvigorated Catholic religious life in certain parts of Europe. But the brewing role was often gone, replaced by newer forms of income or stricter enclosure that discouraged direct manual labor. Even where convents still brewed, the sisters' names began to vanish from the records. Breweries might be listed as monastic or ecclesiastical, but not feminine. The hands behind the barrel staves were no longer mentioned. One rare exception survives in a Flemish ledger from 1591, noting Sister Apollonia's final batch, brewed with last year's dried yarrow. It is a line half buried in a supply list, easy to overlook. And yet, in those 8 words lies an entire world. A final brew, a vanishing craft, and a woman whose name endures only because someone took care to write it down. Today, most popular histories of brewing still focus on the monks, the Belgian abbeys, the Trappist bottles, the hooded silhouettes raising tankards in stained glass. But quietly, over the last few decades, a new interest has emerged in the story of the brewing nuns. Academic researchers have begun cataloging brewing references in convent records. Craft brewers in Europe and North America have launched small-batch alesh inspired by monastic women, sometimes using historic recipes drawn from herbals and grain ledgers. Some women's monasteries, such as those in Belgium and Austria, have even revived brewing, not as major commercial ventures, but as symbolic links to their heritage. Sister brewers now wear aprons over their habits, stirring mash in modern stainless steel tanks while reciting prayers in Latin. These efforts are less about competition and more about remembrance, about placing the brew nuns back into the bubbling timeline of beer history, not as footnotes, but as fermenters in their own right. So if ever you sip a rustic ale, with notes of wildflower, fennel, or wood smoke, pause for a moment. Somewhere in that taste may be the echo of a convent brewhouse, warm and damp with steam, where a woman in quiet obedience stirred a barrel not for profit, but for sustenance. Not for fame, but for the community she served. And perhaps the greatest mystery of all is not what the brewing nuns made, but how many other things they made, loved, and perfected, now lost to the unrecorded quiet of time. Imagine yourself standing at the edge of the Dashti Kaveh, the vast, sun-cracked salt desert of central Iran. The air shimmers with heat, the horizon ripples under a white-blue sky, and yet, here, rising from the parched earth like a misplaced hill, stands something both strange and serene. A domed, earthen mound, cracked and faded by centuries, but still defiantly cool to the touch. You've stumbled upon a yakshal, literally, ice pit, an ancient Persian ice house. It's summer, and yet, deep within the structure's belly, the temperature lingers just above freezing. In the desert, and not a marvel of modern refrigeration, but a technology perfected more than 2,000 years ago. Let's step inside, not literally, of course, because the entrance is steep and the descent narrow. But mentally, let us enter the cold shadows of this forgotten architectural feat and follow the silent story of how people in one of the hottest regions on Earth learned to store winter. Long before electricity and Freon, and long before the first thermometers ticked in laboratories, Persian engineers understood the principles of thermal insulation, evaporative cooling, and the use of night air to trap cold. The earliest known yakshals date to the Achaemenid Empire, c. 500 BCE, a time when Persia stretched from the Indus Valley to the shores of the Aegean. While most of the empire baked under relentless sun, Persian engineers, known then for their qanats, underground water channels, began experimenting with ways to preserve perishables through the hottest months of the year. Their solution wasn't simply to build a cold room. It was to build an entire system, part architecture, part climate engineering, part seasonal choreography. At its core, a yakshal is a conical, dome-shaped building made of saruj, a special mortar composed of clay, ash, sand, goat hair, and lime, which becomes waterproof and heat-resistant once dried. This mixture, more than a meter thick in some places, insulated the ice pit from the external heat. Inside, the floor dropped far below ground level, often by 10 to 15 feet, into a deep chamber where ice was stored. Many yakshals could hold dozens of tons of ice or chilled goods. Some featured vents at the top to release warm air, while others included walls built to cast shade during the hottest parts of the day. Of course, a cool container is only part of the puzzle. The real ingenuity lies in how the ice was made. In winter, during the coldest nights, water was poured into long, shallow pools adjacent to the yakshal. These were built with high insulating walls, oriented to maximize shade and minimize heat exposure. On cold desert nights, often dropping well below freezing, the water froze naturally. The next day, the ice was broken into blocks and hauled, sometimes by mule, sometimes by hand, into the insulated pit of the yakshal. Over time, the layers of ice built up. Straw or sawdust was often packed between layers to prevent melting and sticking. By early spring, the structure was full, and then the gates were sealed. Not permanently, of course. The ice was removed slowly throughout the year, carefully, precisely, used not just for cooling but for medical purposes, food preservation, and even royal feasts. For upper-class households in ancient Persia, serving chilled drinks or sorbets during Nowruz, the Persian New Year, was a quiet display of wealth and status. In a place where temperatures soared past 100 degrees Fahrenheit 38 degrees Celsius in summer, this ability bordered on miraculous. Another marvel of yakshal design was their integration with qanats and wind catchers, two other ancient Persian inventions. Qanats, horizontal underground aqueducts, brought cold groundwater from distant mountain sources to arid settlements. Because these tunnels ran deep underground, the water they carried was cool even at high noon. Some yakshals were directly connected to qanats, ensuring a steady supply of fresh water for freezing during winter and use during summer. Wind catchers, called badgers, were vertical towers that funneled wind down into a structure, pushing cool air into the lower chambers and expelling hot air upward. Some yakshals had these towers integrated directly into their design, allowing for passive cooling even in the warm months. The result: a natural refrigerator, fully off-grid, built more than a millennium before such a term even existed. The ingenuity of it all is difficult to overstate. Where medieval European ice was a luxury imported in carts from mountain passes, and where much of the ancient world had no storage at all, Persians were quietly engineering temperature with mud, airflow, and sunlight. To the casual passerby, the yakshal may have seemed like a mysterious hill. But to the communities who used them, they were essential to survival. Records are sparse, but oral traditions in Yazd, Kerman, and Kashan, regions still home to functioning or preserved yakshals, tell of entire communities organizing their winters around ice harvesting days. Teenagers and young men would rise before dawn to tend to the freezing pools, breaking ice with wooden paddles and hauling it indoors. Mothers and daughters prepared cloth wrappings to help preserve the ice, or collected the meltwater in clay jars for summer cooking. Merchants paid fees to access stored ice in spring, and bakers sometimes chilled dough during hot spells by placing it in clay containers set in the lowest chambers. Yakshals were never just for royalty. Some were public utilities, maintained by communities, funded by taxes or charitable waqf, religious endowments. Others were semi-private, used by caravanserais to cool goods and serve chilled drinks to weary travelers moving across the Silk Roads. One traveler's account from the 10th century, written in Arabic, marvels that the Persians cool water with air alone, and even their poorest men sip cold juice in the summer months, as if the mountains themselves were tapped. There is a quiet beauty to a yakshal's symmetry. The domes are not just for aesthetics, they reflect heat away while minimizing surface area. The clay mortar changes color with the light, casting shadows that deepen at midday. During summer, the inside remains dim and still, echoing slightly, like a chapel to forgotten winters. Their construction was precise. Builders often dug down before building up, ensuring the storage chamber stayed below the frost line. The dome was then constructed without scaffolding, using a spiral mudbrick technique, forming a continuous curve that hardened in the sun. Some had small stairways descending into the chambers. Others relied on pulley systems to lower and lift goods. All were built with remarkable patience, requiring months, sometimes years, of planning and coordination. And yet, you won't find these structures in most architecture textbooks. They are not charted alongside Roman aqueducts or Egyptian pyramids, though their function is just as enduring. Today, some yakshils still stand, quiet and forgotten at the edge of expanding cities. Their domes are cracked, their chambers dry, and their pools long since filled with sand. A few have been restored as historical monuments, but many are simply ignored, too practical to be sacred, too old to be modern. Yet beneath their domes lie echoes of icy mornings, barefoot haulers, chilled melon slices under the desert sun, and the clink of clay jugs against stone. How did a civilization so attuned to heat come to master cold so gently? As we step further into history, beyond the domes of clay and into the age of empires, you find yourself standing beside a yakshil not just as a curious structure, but as a living symbol of Persia's growing sophistication. From the 9th through 13th centuries, as the Islamic Golden Age spread science, architecture, and trade across continents, the humble ice house was no longer just a survival tool. It became part of a cultural tapestry, woven through medicine, cuisine, luxury, and logistics. The desert still burned in summer. The sun still poured over the high plains. But by now, cold, captured, shaped, and dispensed, was a sign of order, refinement, and urban intelligence. And yakshils quietly stood at the center of this transformation. In the early Abbasid period, 8th to 9th century CE, Persian cities like Nishapur, Ray, and Isfahan blossomed into cultural and commercial centers. Trade caravans moved goods between the Mediterranean and China. Scholars translated Greek and Indian works into Arabic and Persian. Engineers improved Qanat systems, and royal courts grew in opulence. Among the many luxuries these courts indulged in, fragrant oils, silks, elaborate calligraphy, was a growing taste for cold things. The use of yakshils expanded beyond mere ice storage. Now, the ice itself became a commodity, used not only to cool water, but to make sherbets, syrups, and even early forms of faluda, a chilled dessert of vermicelli and rosewater that still survives in Persian cuisine today. A document from the Buyid dynasty, 10th century, records that the emir of Shiraz kept ice from the high valleys and domed houses delivered daily in woven straw boxes, cooled with pressed snow and salted cloth. Servants would crush it and mix it with grape must or pomegranate juice for summer guests. In elite circles, serving chilled refreshments during feasts was both a courtesy and a quiet show of administrative control. It meant your city could store and distribute cold year-round. By the 11th century, particularly in cities like Yazd and Kerman, sherbet sellers, known as sharbetfrosh, had become common figures. These vendors often drew from yakshils to chill their wares, juices of sour cherry, quince, or tamarind sweetened with honey or sugarcane, and sold them in clay mugs from carts shaded with date palm fronds. Many of these sellers were women. Operating in family-run shops or roadside stalls, they offered not just cold drinks, but sore throat remedies, digestive coolers, and heat stroke preventatives during the long Persian summer. In market records from this era, you find mentions of ice allocations to vendors, taxed by city authorities, but often administered through wax-supported yakshils. Some communities designated specific hours for the public to draw ice, and others reserved access for physicians, travelers, and merchants delivering perishable goods. The cold was now part of urban infrastructure, woven into daily rhythms and carefully managed by both tradition and state. In the Islamic medical tradition, deeply influenced by Galenic and Ayurvedic principles, balance among bodily humors, hot, cold, dry, and wet, was the foundation of health. In this worldview, cold things were often used to treat fevers, inflammations, and agitation. Ice from yakshils was grated or shaved, then mixed into compresses or tonics. Physicians in major cities, often serving in bimaristans, early hospitals, documented precise uses for chilled water to ease headaches, calm stomachs, and treat what they called burning melancholies. In Persian poetry, too, cold became a metaphor for grace, stillness, and mental clarity. The 12th century poet Nizami likens the breath of a beloved to the wind over a Yakshal dome, cool and necessary in moments of heat. The association of winter in the desert with peace and beauty echoed through metaphors and moral tales. In this way, the ice house was not just a technology, it was part of a shared cultural logic. A way of understanding the self, the city, and the world. As Persian empires expanded their administrative networks, ice became part of larger logistical systems. Caravanserais, roadside inns for traders and travelers, were often built with small cold rooms or shaded basins. In mountainous regions, ice was cut from glaciers or alpine ponds and transported to central depots. These deliveries were slow, often taking days, and insulated with straw, wool, or snow-packed clay. Where natural ice could not be sourced, cities relied on yakshals, whose predictable harvest cycles allowed for planned distribution. Municipal accounts from Seljuk-era Isfahan detail contracts with ice porters, teams of donkeys or camels used to ferry chilled blocks between yakshals, markets, and palace kitchens. Taxation documents list ice weights as a commodity measured in man, roughly 3 to 4 kilograms, with variable rates depending on season, use, and distance. These networks highlight something quietly profound. While most of medieval Europe still viewed cold as either a mountain hazard or aristocratic indulgence, Persia had turned cold into an organized resource. Though often omitted from grand chronicles, women played an important role in this cold economy. In urban homes, women were the primary managers of food preservation. During hot months, they relied on chilled ceramic jars, kept in cellars or stone cisterns, to store butter, milk, rosewater, and pickles. Ice drawn from a neighborhood yakshal might be used to keep herbs fresh or to cool the bathing water of infants and elders. Recipes passed through generations included instructions for wrapping perishables in fig leaves, storing yogurt in sunken pots, and timing visits to the yakshal during low-demand hours, typically after dawn or during midday prayer, when queues were shortest. In poorer households, the use of ice was sparing but meaningful, reserved for fevers, childbirth, or honored guests. Ice was not abundant, but its presence was felt, tied to ritual, kindness, and care. During this period, yakshal architecture saw subtle improvements. Builders experimented with multi-dome systems, multi-level cooling, and even reflective plasters to deflect sunlight. Some yakshals were redesigned with stepped roofs, allowing better access for winter ice delivery. Others featured subterranean channels connected to canets, creating a chilled airflow loop that reduced internal temperatures by several degrees. Masons became specialists in sarouge application, developing trade secrets to increase waterproofing or reduce cracking. Families of builders passed these skills across generations, leaving small signatures, stylized bricks, carved initials, on hidden surfaces of domes. And all the while, the ice came and went, year after year, dome after dome. As the 13th century drew to a close, a storm gathered on the horizon, not of climate, but of conquest. The Mongol invasions shattered many cities, disrupted khanats, and depopulated regions. Yakshals stood, but often alone, their keepers gone or scattered. Still, some structures endured. Those in remote villages or under patronage of smaller courts were maintained, sometimes without much change, for centuries to come. But the golden era of Persia's cold infrastructure, the age of regulated ice, public sherbet, and architectural refinement, was now entering a long twilight. One wonders, by the 14th century, much of Persia's once unified infrastructure, roads, irrigation channels, domed ice houses, had suffered damage, neglect, or outright abandonment in the wake of the Mongol conquests and the fragmentation of empire. Cities rebuilt slowly. Some recovered, others faded into the margins of maps. But the yakshal remained, part ruin, part relic, part quiet necessity. In this final chapter, we watch the slow drift of history as the world around the yakshals changes. From imperial dynasties to colonial encounters, from dusty survival to quiet rediscovery, the ice houses linger on, half-buried, sun-bleached, and stubbornly standing. Not forgotten exactly, but no longer essential. They become places of memory, of mystery, and of waiting. The rise of the Timurid dynasty, 14th to 15th centuries, brought a brief revival of Persian architecture and city planning. In cities like Herat and Samarkand, new schools, caravanserais, and bazaars were built. Yakshals were restored as part of civic investment, especially those associated with hospitals or pilgrimage centers. Yet something had changed. With increasing centralization of royal courts, cooling, once a civic and communal concern, became increasingly privatized. Large estates and palaces constructed their own enclosed cooling systems. Underground ice rooms, shaded pools, and even wind tunnels for their gardens. These innovations were derived from Yakshal principles but redesigned for luxury and seclusion. In smaller towns, traditional Yakshals were often maintained through local Waqf, charitable foundations, but the communal support systems that had once kept them pristine began to erode. Meanwhile, climatic shifts in the early modern period, the so-called Little Ice Age in parts of the Northern Hemisphere, brought unexpected cold to regions unaccustomed to it. In Persia, this sometimes meant harsher winters for freezing water, but also disrupted rainfall and increased desertification, which damaged the Qanat networks that fed Yakshals. A brilliant system was now faltering not from failure, but from the slow erosion of the social and environmental web that had sustained it. During the Qajar dynasty, 1789 to 1925, Persia entered a new phase of internal reform and foreign pressure. European observers visited, drew sketches, and puzzled over strange mud domes that stored ice in the desert. Some British travelers speculated that the Yakshals must be shrines or granaries. One German engineer, visiting in the 1860s, remarked, "It is as if the earth has built a stomach and filled it with winter." Yet even as Western interest grew, local use was declining. Urban households in Tehran and Isfahan increasingly relied on smaller ice pits, constructed in courtyards or beneath kitchen floors, drawing ice from the mountains via donkey caravan. This shift mirrored a global trend, the localization of refrigeration, as infrastructure became individualized. Some cities began using imported snow from the Elburz Mountains, packed in felt-lined crates and sold in summer markets. These deliveries, once communal, now catered to those who could afford it. Yakshals, once central, now stood at the edge of towns, visited only on market days or for emergencies. A few remained in active use, patched with lime, shaded by palm fronds, manned by aging custodians who still remembered how to layer straw between ice slabs. But others simply sat, quiet, cracked, and full of sand. As their practical use faded, Yakshals entered a different kind of preservation, oral memory. Children were told that jinns slept beneath the domes. Young boys dared one another to descend the icy steps. Elders remembered the taste of quince sherbet from weddings long past, chilled in the house of snow. The domes acquired nicknames, wind bellies, cold mothers, or simply the mound. In Yazd, one surviving Yakshal became a gathering spot for summer storytelling. In Kerman, another was converted into a temporary storage for fruit sellers, who lined the walls with crates of melons. Though the structures were slowly losing their identity, they were not forgotten. They had become landmarks of emotional geography. The place where your grandfather once fetched ice for your fever, or where a wedding dowry included the right to 3 summer deliveries from the dome. The 20th century brought electric refrigeration to Iran's cities. Ice factories opened in Tabriz, Tehran, and Shiraz. Families bought cool boxes, then refrigerators. The cool hum of motors replaced the echo of clay chambers. Yakshals were now obsolete. Some were demolished to make way for roads or houses. Others collapsed during earthquakes or were scavenged for bricks and clay. But a few, strangely stubbornly, remained. Their domes too thick to bulldoze easily. Their foundations too deep to move. One by one, they were fenced off, ignored, or painted over with election slogans and football graffiti. And yet, they had endured for more than 2,000 years. Through empire and exile, dust storm and downpour. A few curious architects and preservationists began documenting them in the 1970s and 1980s. Measurements were taken, diagrams drawn. Some were stabilized with government grants or reimagined as heritage sites. Yazd, today a UNESCO World Heritage City, features a restored Yakshal that visitors can enter. Inside, with the heat pressing outside the dome, the air is cool and still. A whisper of winter in the desert. So now, imagine again that you are standing beside a yakshal, centuries old, chipped and sun-washed, its mud walls home to lizards and moss. You run your fingers across the rough saruj, feeling the silent residue of thousands of frozen mornings. You listen closely and almost hear it. The clink of a wooden bucket, the soft scrape of snow against straw, the measured breath of someone laboring in a sacred rhythm, stacking cold into the future. These structures, once filled with ice, now hold only memory. But isn't memory its own kind of preservation? And perhaps the question that lingers longer than the cold is this. Picture yourself traveling along the Via Agrippa, one of the principal roads of Roman Gaul. The year is 65 CE. The morning air carries a faint scent of damp stone and distant wood smoke. You are walking among merchants, ox-drawn carts, imperial postmen, and somewhere in the bustle, concealed among amphorae of oil and crates of dried figs, lies something far more pungent: illicit cheese. Yes, cheese. Specifically, cheese made in the provincial backwaters of Gaul, smuggled into Roman cities despite tariffs, restrictions, and, occasionally, accusations of indecency. It's not a tale of empire and conquest, but of fermentation, bureaucracy, and appetite, as Roman as togas and aqueducts, and far more aromatic. Let's take a closer look at how a humble wheel of cheese became both a treasured delicacy and an item of concern for Roman tax collectors. Romans, especially of the upper classes, took food seriously, elevating it from nourishment to art. Their cookbooks detailed sauces, their dining rooms were temples to appetite, and their elite chefs often commanded respect bordering on fear. Cheese, in particular, held a central place in the Roman pantry. Made from goat, sheep, or cow's milk, it came in dozens of varieties. Soft, aged, smoked, herb-coated, or brined. Pliny the Elder, in his encyclopedic natural history, ranked regional cheeses by quality, favoring those from the Alps and from Nemosis, modern Nîmes, in Gaul. But not all cheese was praised equally. Some varieties were considered too rustic, too pungent, or worse, too popular among the lower classes. And herein lies the beginning of the problem. As Roman control solidified over Gaul in the late Republic and early Empire, a curious thing happened. Gaulish pastoralists, long seen as uncivilized by their Roman overlords, began supplying the empire with what many citizens craved: salted, hearty, long-lasting cheese. The cheese was made from the milk of robust mountain sheep and goats in the regions we now call Auvergne and the Massif Central. Its texture was firm, its smell earthy, and it traveled well across long distances, especially important for Roman soldiers, who carried wheels of hard cheese on campaigns as rations. Soon, Gaulish cheese began showing up not only in legionary camps but on the tables of wealthy Romans in Lugdunum, modern Lyon, Massilia, Marseille, and even Rome itself. But as the cheese grew in popularity, so did Roman scrutiny. Roman administrators were obsessive about taxation, on land, goods, slaves, wine, fish sauce, and yes, even cheese. To regulate supply and ensure the grain-based economy stayed dominant, Rome established import quotas for certain non-essential provincial goods. Cheese fell into this gray area, valued by some, disdained by others. It was taxed by weight or volume, especially when brought into cities with high trade volume like Lugdunum. Merchants were required to declare cheese at customs posts known as stations along key roads. Officials would weigh goods, issue stamped lead tokens called vectigalia, and charge fees accordingly. These taxes, minor in theory, could eat into the narrow profit margins of rural cheesemakers. To complicate matters, some urban officials believed the cheese from rural Gaul was too strong, offending Roman tastes and disrupting the stomach's balance. As one medical text sniffily observed, by 60 CE, at least 2 major cities had imposed restrictions on selling certain kinds of cheese in open markets. The logic was part sanitation, part snobbery, but it opened a door for circumvention. Faced with taxes, restrictions, and prejudice, many small-time traders turned to smuggling. Wheels of hard cheese, sometimes coated in wax, other times in cloth, were hidden in barrels marked as olives, sacks of wool, or even beneath grain shipments, which enjoyed lighter scrutiny due to their strategic importance. Some traders bribed customs officials with a sliver of their wares. Others employed local children to carry small wheels by foot through woodland paths that bypassed checkpoints. A particularly clever tactic involved packing cheese inside sealed amphorae, layered beneath fish sauce or honey, a pungent cloak hiding an even stronger scent. The scale was modest. Cheese smuggling was not a vast criminal enterprise, but it was widespread, and often committed by women, especially widows or daughters of herdsmen, who carried baskets to market with an extra, undeclared wedge wrapped in linen. Roman tastes were complex. What was banned one year could become fashionable the next. Certain Gaulish cheeses, especially those aged in caves and covered with rind mites, began to attract aristocratic curiosity. Their strong flavor was unlike anything in Latium. Some nobles claimed it was a delicacy that required a trained tongue. A letter from a senator in 78 CE jokes about a gift of contraband curds, sent in secret from a friend stationed near the Pyrenees. The senator claims to have served them at a feast without revealing their origin, much to the delight and later confusion of his guests. Thus began a quiet trend. Smuggled cheese not only bypassed taxes but carried an air of rebellious indulgence. What was once peasant food became a status symbol precisely because it was illegal. At its core, the cheese story is not only about trade, but about identity. Gauls had long been seen by Romans as barbarians, an image rooted in the Republic's early wars and Caesar's commentaries. But by the 1st century CE, many Gauls were Roman citizens. They served in the army, governed cities, read Latin poetry. Yet in their food, in their cheese, they kept something older. Fermented, sharp, stubborn. Cheese became a quiet emblem of cultural resilience. A shepherd in the Auvergne could feed his children, pay tribute to Rome, and still tuck aside a wheel for barter, trade, or gifting. Unlike land or coin, cheese was ephemeral. You couldn't trace it easily, and so it moved quietly, steadily, along forest paths and village lanes. As the sun sets over Lugdunum, casting long shadows over tiled roofs and market squares, a woman unrolls a cloth at her street stall. Among the figs and almonds, there's a wedge of cheese, sharp, unmarked, and definitely untaxed. She offers it quietly to a returning legionary, whose nose wrinkles at first, then smiles. He bites, he nods, he pays in coin and walks on, and somewhere an official looks the other way. After all, it's just cheese. But in that wedge lies a whole world of culture, survival, and the quiet persistence of taste, despite the empire's best efforts. It is now the 2nd century of the Common Era. The Roman Empire is near its peak in both territory and infrastructure. Trade flows from Britannia to Arabia. Grain ships sail across the Mediterranean, and Lugdunum, modern-day Lyon, is flourishing as a key provincial hub. Yet amid the imperial monuments and marble forums, the hum of daily life goes on. Bakers bake, butchers slice, and at the edge of the marketplace, the smell of something stronger than fish sauce curls into the air. Cheese, aged, salted, and possibly smuggled. This next phase of our story takes us deeper into the world where cheese intersected with logistics, status, and public regulation. While emperors and governors debated war and taxes, ordinary people worried about simpler matters: sourcing affordable food, preserving taste, and avoiding the gaze of overzealous tax inspectors. And the cheese? It was still moving, still being hidden, still being sold in cracked baskets under woven mats. Roman legions were marvels of discipline, administration, and supply. Soldiers received standardized rations: grain, usually wheat or barley, vinegar, pasca, dried legumes, and when possible, cheese. In Gaul, especially in outposts like Lugdunum, Argentoratum, modern Strasbourg, and Treverorum, modern Trier, local cheese, durable and calorie-rich, became a key part of the legion's diet. It was easier to transport than meat, less fragile than fresh produce, and provided much-needed fats and proteins. But there was a hitch. Cheese procurement had to be recorded. Army quartermasters kept detailed accounts of what was bought and from whom. Local producers were contracted, but when demand outpaced official supply, soldiers turned to informal vendors. It wasn't uncommon for auxiliary troops or veterans to barter for cheese in back alleys or receive it as a gift from grateful townsfolk. A fragment of a military requisition from Germania Inferior c. 165 CE notes a missing delivery of 40 librae, roughly 13 kilograms, of Caseus gallorum, Gaulish cheese. The note mentions that the goods had to be acquired by other means, a Roman euphemism for off-the-books trade. The army may have been strict, but hunger and taste had its own quiet chain of command. With cities growing, Roman municipal officials' aediles were responsible for overseeing public sanitation, weights and measures, and market behavior. Their duties were thankless and detail-heavy, involving inspections of bakeries, butcher stalls, and yes, cheese vendors. Cheese was regulated not only as a foodstuff but as a potential nuisance. Some aged varieties were believed to cause indigestion or emit odors unfit for refined company, especially during hot weather. Pliny the Elder, always detailed in his observations, claimed that cheese from the Gallic highlands pursues the nose with ill temper. Certain cities began issuing market codes, lists of approved goods and where they could be sold. Cheese, especially imported or aged varieties, was sometimes restricted to outer stalls, placed near meat vendors or behind cloth markets to reduce exposure to respectable shoppers. A fragmentary inscription from Lugdunum, c. 140 CE, declares that no foreign or salted cheese is to be sold within the basilica precinct, referring to the city's central, roofed marketplace. The rule seems petty, but it was likely a response to growing urban sensitivities, wealthier citizens seeking a more curated sensory experience. Of course, what counted as foreign or salted was open to interpretation. Local traders simply moved to side alleys, relied on coded phrases, or bribed inspectors with a slice of the product in question. By this time, the smuggling of cheese had become less about dramatic concealment and more about quiet systems of trust. Vendors and buyers developed routines, regular drop-off points, code words, and portable scales that could be hidden in a cloak or basket. Children were often used as runners, less suspicious, more nimble. Some enterprising tavern keepers offered second lists of goods for trusted customers, including aged Gaulish cheese not found on the official menu. Roman satire of the period hints at this behavior. In one poem by Martial, a wealthy host complains of receiving brined fish and goat cheese in wrappers that smell of the hills, a likely jab at provincial goods sneaking into elite Roman banquets under cover of anonymity. Notably, many of the sellers were women, especially widows or freedwomen. Roman law gave female citizens, particularly those not under male guardianship, limited rights to run businesses. Cheese selling, low prestige, low capital, was one avenue open to them. A scratched list on a potsherd from Augusta Trevororum, likely a shopkeeper's note, lists panis, mel, vinum, caseus, non-recens, bread, honey, wine, cheese, not fresh, emphasizing that aged cheese was a specific ask, one that perhaps required discretion. What began as rustic fare, then stigmatized as too strong or too rural, gradually evolved into something else entirely, a marker of refined taste. By the mid-2nd century CE, Roman aristocrats, ever drawn to the exotic, began seeking out the more pungent Gaulish cheeses as part of culinary fashion. Aged cheese, paired with honey, figs, or nuts, was offered as an appetizer or dessert. Recipes in Apicius's cookbook, likely compiled in this period, include cheese sauces and fermented milk dishes that echo Gallic styles. This reversal was not universal. Strong smells still offended many, and some still considered it crude, but the pendulum had begun to swing. What had once been contraband was now coveted by the elite, not despite its provincial origins, but because of them. The more difficult the cheese was to obtain, the greater its appeal. Ironically, this raised new problems for regulators. Suddenly, the same products they had tried to tax or suppress were being served in senators' homes. Smuggling didn't disappear, it simply migrated upward, refined into quieter methods of delivery and payment. All the while, ordinary people kept eating. Shepherds kept aging their wheels in cool caves. Soldiers kept buying wedges from roadside stalls. Children learned to recognize sellers by smell alone. Cheese became a food of continuity, threading together poor and rich, Roman and Gaul, legal and illicit. It was traded in copper coins and favors. It was eaten on benches and marble couches alike. And it was rarely talked about in history books. So you walk again through a Roman street, stone underfoot, sunlight filtering through linen awnings. Somewhere, a woman unwraps a small parcel for a customer. They whisper. Coins pass hands. A child carries a basket. A cat lingers nearby. No one writes it down. But the cheese is there. Still strong. Still traded. Still part of the quiet engine that powered Roman daily life. As the Roman Empire staggered into its twilight centuries, the cities of Gaul became quieter. Roads once alive with merchants and legionnaires grew overgrown in places. Amphitheaters fell silent. Statues weathered. But not all activity stopped. Beneath the imperial pomp, the rhythms of daily life carried on. Baking, herding, tanning, weaving, and cheesemaking. This final section follows cheese as it moved from a lightly contraband delicacy to a humble, enduring part of late Roman and early medieval life. The markets changed. The rules loosened. The empires cracked. And the cheese remained. By the mid-3rd century CE, the Western Roman Empire began to unravel under the weight of economic instability, military overreach, and political chaos. Gaul saw waves of invasions, civil wars, and local uprisings. Cities like Lugdunum, once humming centers of commerce, suffered sackings and slow decline. Trade became more localized. Long-distance supply chains, grain from Egypt, spices from India, amphorae from Hispania, grew harder to sustain. As imperial coinage devalued and centralized authority shrank, people relied more heavily on regional goods and barter-based economies. For cheesemakers, the disruption of bureaucracy brought unexpected freedom. The stations, customs posts, crumbled. Market inspections became rare. Tax collectors found themselves unpaid or unwelcome. The smuggling of cheese simply faded into legitimacy. What had been illicit was now overlooked or folded into informal networks of trade between villages, estates, and small towns. During this period, many wealthy Romans, unable to rely on distant trade, invested in self-sufficient villi rusticae, rural estates with attached farms, workshops, and storage facilities. These estates, scattered across Gaul, often included dairies and cheese-pressing rooms, managed by enslaved or tenant laborers. Cheese became not just a supplement but a staple of estate life, a product to store, trade, gift, or consume over winter. One preserved account from a late Roman estate near Narbo, modern Narbonne, describes the use of cheese and wine, both local, for payment to laborers during harvest. Other records mention formaticum, a general term for cheese, as part of military provisions, tax in kind, or dowries. This domestication of cheesemaking marked a return to its roots. Women and servants once again oversaw much of the process, from milking to curdling to aging. A wheel of cheese now told the story of the land where it was made, not of markets and smuggling, but of survival. As Roman administration faded in the 5th century, new powers rose in Gaul. The Visigoths, the Franks, and eventually a tapestry of early medieval polities. Latin gave way to local dialects. City-states became fortified villages. But the culinary traditions remained surprisingly resilient. Cheese remained a central part of rural diets. Salted and smoked cheeses helped preserve dairy through winter. Harder varieties were used in bread-making, grated into stews, or eaten with barley flatbread. In monasteries, soon to become the new centers of knowledge and food innovation, cheesemaking became codified again. Interestingly, many of the earliest medieval cheese names, Cantal, Roquefort, Brie, are rooted in Gallic-Roman toponyms. While the smuggling records disappeared, the flavors remained, passed down by hands that learned from grandmothers who once bartered by roadside shrines. In this way, Gaulish cheese made its quiet transformation, from item of suspicion to symbol of place, from outlaw to heritage. With the collapse of Roman control came the end of centralized regulation. There were no more aediles weighing baskets at the gate. No more amphorae cracked open to reveal pungent wedges. Smuggling, once a game of evasion and creativity, was no longer necessary. What emerged instead were cottage industries, monastic dairies, and village fairs where cheese was exchanged openly. Its political weight dissolved, but its cultural weight deepened. The smell of Gaulish cheese, once offensive to Roman sensibilities, was now simply the smell of home. And the techniques remained: the layering of curds, the brining in clay jars, the storing in cool caves. In abbey kitchens and wooden barns, the old rhythms survived, beaten by new hands, yet following old beats. If you ever find yourself in a stone cellar in southern France, or a cave carved into a hillside in Auvergne, take a breath. The scent may remind you of something old, earthy, strong, lingering. That scent is not just fermentation. It's a whisper of trade routes, of whispered deals, of a woman hiding a wedge in her shawl and slipping past the tax post at dusk. It's a story that no historian wrote down in full. But that doesn't mean it disappeared. So now the question becomes, when empire fades and laws dissolve, what flavors remain to tell the tale of the everyday? And if you follow the cheese, what else might you discover about the people who once lived, bartered, and dined beneath the crumbling stones of Rome? Let us now walk softly through another world, quiet, ordered, and humming with a sense of deliberate calm. It is the early 17th century, and you find yourself in the rice-rich lowlands of central Honshu, Japan. The sun is low. A crow calls from a tiled rooftop, and along a narrow path between thatched farmhouses, a man in sandals squats beside a wooden board. He isn't praying. He's counting. Not crops, not coins, cows. Specifically, how many cattle grazed this field last year, how many were born, how many sold, how many died of hoof rot, and how many are due to calve next month. His brush moves slowly. He makes a mark in ink. And with that mark, the smooth machinery of the Tokugawa bureaucracy inches forward. This is not a story of samurai duels or shogunate intrigue. It is, instead, a story about how Edo period Japan, renowned for its art, order, and isolation, developed a deeply methodical system for counting, categorizing, and managing livestock. Quiet, tedious, exacting, and strangely beautiful in its precision. When Tokugawa Ieyasu unified Japan at the turn of the 17th century, he ushered in more than 2 centuries of peace. This period, known as the Edo period, 1603 to 1868, was marked by tight social control, flourishing culture, and a deeply codified society. Japan's political system was feudal in structure but bureaucratic in spirit. The shogunate sat in Edo, modern Tokyo, while daimyo, regional lords, governed provinces, answering to the central authority. Beneath them were village headmen, samurai scribes, tax officials, and, key to our story, livestock enumerators. Though Japan's economy revolved primarily around rice, cattle held a special place in rural life, not for meat, but as plow animals, pack carriers, and manure producers. Managing them was not simply a matter of tending barns. It was a state concern, subject to rules, rituals, and records. In Edo, Japan, cows were not eaten. The prevailing Buddhist norms, combined with legal prohibitions on meat consumption, meant that beef was rarely consumed publicly, at least before the Meiji Restoration in 1868. Instead, cows were tools, essential for pulling plows through clay-heavy paddies, for hauling harvests, and for generating the fertilizer that fueled rice production. As such, cows were subject to meticulous registration, much like land or labor. Each region maintained a cattle ledger, known as a ashicho, in which every registered bovine was logged with its physical description, horns, coat color, markings, owner's name and village affiliation, age and reproductive status, service history, used for plowing, breeding, or cart pulling, incidentals, injuries, illnesses, transfers. These ledgers were often maintained by village scribes, who worked under hayakusho, head farmers, and submitted quarterly updates to district officials. Mistakes were not taken lightly. A discrepancy in the cow count could trigger inspections, or worse, suspicion of tax evasion or smuggling. Enumerators didn't rely on Arabic numerals. Instead, they used kanji tally marks and symbolic strokes. A cow counted in service might be marked with a single vertical line, One born that year might be shown with a left-leaning slash. Deaths were recorded with a small cross. To the trained eye, a cow's life story could be read like a poem of brushstrokes. Laconic, precise, utterly bureaucratic. Some ledgers were decorated with ink drawings, identifying particularly valuable cows with stylized ears or curved horns. Others used paper tags or woven ropes to identify animals, especially during inspections or transfers between villages. There is something oddly intimate about these documents. They were not written for posterity. They were tools of control but also care. A scribe might note that cow 3, Blackford, of Tobiai's field, refused feed in autumn rains. It's the sort of line that no history book remembers, but that mattered deeply to the people who depended on that cow. The importance of cows extended beyond plowing. Their manure, known as kigo, was prized by farmers, especially those managing multiple fields on rotating schedules. Some villages imposed communal fertilizer quotas, dividing manure between plots based on planting cycles. Others sold manure at fixed prices, logged by the cartload. In certain districts, cattle were rotated between hamlets, with accompanying notarial paperwork to record movement. These short-term transfers, Ushino Kachikoshi, were governed by regional rules and mediated by headmen. Fees were sometimes paid in rice or salt. In lean years, they might be paid in kind, a basket of millet, a batch of dried radish. But always the exchange was recorded. Always the cow was counted. It was a system built not on machines or clocks, but on rhythms. Planting and harvest, brush and ledger, hoof and plow. And behind it all, the belief that to manage cows well was to manage society well. Not every cow was welcome. The Tokugawa government, ever wary of imbalance, sometimes imposed population caps on cattle herds to prevent land overuse or hoarding by wealthier farmers. Some domains enforced breeding limits. Others levied taxes on calving or required permits for sales. This led to a delicate balance. Farmers wanted enough cattle to ensure agricultural productivity, but not so many that they drew official ire or depleted communal grazing lands. In rare cases, conflicts broke out over pasture rights. Villages on the edge of river valleys often shared grazing fields. A scribe's record from 1714 in Kozuk province describes a dispute between two hamlets over the nighttime grazing of 6 cows, not declared in prior registry. The disagreement led to arbitration by a local magistrate, who fined one village a barrel of barley. Such incidents were uncommon, but reveal the degree to which even the smallest hoofprint could ripple through a carefully balanced system. While ledgers were kept by male scribes, much of the daily care of cows fell to women and children. In farming households, women were responsible for feeding, cleaning, and monitoring cattle health. Children often helped gather grass or sweep stalls. Their labor was rarely mentioned in the records, but without them, the neat brushstrokes of the Ushicho would have meant little. Cows were rarely named in official records, but in private they often were. Oral traditions speak of cows called kuro, aim, or tora, and some families pass down tales of particularly loyal or productive animals. In this quiet, rural world, a cow might live 12 to 15 years. It might plow the same field, sleep in the same stall, and be brushed by the same hands for more than a decade. And when it died, its passing logged in tidy script, it left behind more than a mark. It left behind a pattern of life, woven into that village's survival. As the sun sets again over Edo, Japan, a scribe dips his brush in ink and makes a final note in the corner of a page. The cow he marked last spring has calved. He nods, closes the ledger, and walks home. The cow will not know it has been counted, but the field will be plowed. The rice will be sown, and the balance, delicate, bureaucratic, and utterly human, will hold for one more season. And so one must wonder, in a world obsessed with drama and noise, what might we learn from those who ruled with ink, straw, and the steady rhythm of a cow's hoof on soft earth? It is now the middle of the 18th century, and the air in Edo, Japan is filled with the scent of blooming plum trees and drying thatch. The country is at peace. Roads are busy with pilgrimages and processions, but the distant rumble of cannon fire belongs only to history books, not present fears. Still, beneath this calm, the the meticulous system that governs agriculture and livestock presses forward with unwavering consistency. In this section, we move beyond the pastures and paddies to peer more deeply into the administrative machine behind cattle management. The humble cow, still unseen in woodblock prints and samurai tales, remains a silent linchpin of the countryside economy. And as farms grow more productive, so too do the registers, inspectors, and informal networks that document and guide each animal's life. The Tokugawa shogunate had long understood that order was achieved through observation. In addition to its systems for registering people, weapons, marriages, and temples, livestock was tracked with a thoroughness matched only by rice yields. By the 1700s, the role of Ushiadarashime, a kind of cattle census agent, had become more formalized in many domains. These officials were dispatched seasonally or annually, sometimes by horseback, to inspect registered cows and ensure that local ledgers were accurate. Their tools were simple: brush, ink, a thin wooden tally counter, and a memory for detail. But their role was significant. These officials verified ownership and matched animals to their records, ensured that pastures were not overstocked, investigated claims of theft or loss, mediated disputes over breeding rights and shared grazing land. Their presence was rarely dramatic but quietly powerful. An incorrect entry might result in fines, forced transfers of livestock, or, in extreme cases, withdrawal of farming privileges. Most villages maintained a main cattle ledger, ashicho, held in the care of the headman or appointed scribe. These ledgers were accumulative, pages added year after year, edges worn smooth by handling, some ink faded to brown. The layout was as structured as a temple garden. Rows of kanji marking ownership, usage, and notable incidents. Sometimes marginal notes offered color: calved twins in the year of the fire, or prone to wander, kept tied with red cord. Corrections were rare. Instead, errors were struck through with a light slash, preserving the record's integrity. No one wanted to give the impression of falsification. Some larger villages kept duplicate ledgers, one for local use, another for submission to district authorities. These copies, often transcribed by young samurai of low rank, provided training in calligraphy and administration, blending aesthetics with agronomy. The cow, once again, served not only the field but the file. Cattle were valued not just for labor, but for what they left behind. By the mid-18th century, the Kigo economy, the system of manure trade, had become central to agricultural planning. In regions around Kyoto, Nara, and Osaka, cow dung was sold in bulk, often exchanged in units of koku, the same unit used for rice. Farmers without cattle purchased fertilizer from those who had surplus. Prices fluctuated seasonally, and contracts were often agreed upon in winter for spring delivery. Some townships even appointed manure brokers, responsible for mediating trades and collecting small commissions. These brokers developed close relationships with livestock owners and were known for sensitive negotiation skills. After all, the product was highly perishable and difficult to transport. Ledgers included manure outputs by cow, sometimes estimating by cartload or bucket. These entries, while less glamorous, were essential for crop rotation planning and reflected a society where waste was not wasted. Though cows were not eaten, owning them was still a sign of social standing, especially in agricultural districts. Wealthier farmers maintained larger stables, sometimes with 6 or more animals. These cows were sheltered in purpose-built barns, thatched against wind and sun, with water troughs and even individual stalls. Less affluent households might share a cow between extended families or between neighbors. In mountainous regions, grazing cooperatives were common, allowing multiple families to collectively feed and use 1 or 2 animals. These arrangements were governed by verbal agreements, rarely written but still respected. Occasionally, a dispute would rise to the attention of magistrates. One 1763 case in Shinano province details an argument over whose cow had impregnated a neighbor's heifer. The matter involved 3 families, a broker, and a drawn map of a shared pasture, all over a calf not yet born. Such disputes seem trivial now, but in a society where manure was money, labor was seasonal, and cows were capital, they mattered deeply. While most cows in Edo Japan were not bred for speed or meat, Their temperament, strength, and size were closely monitored. Some provinces developed preferences. Kaga cattle were known for broad backs and steady gait. Tosa breeds were smaller but more agile on hills. Shinana herds had dense coats, ideal for colder regions. Selective breeding was guided not by genetics but by experience and village memory. Families tracked the outcomes of specific matings. Exceptional cows were remembered across generations, even if unnamed in the ledgers. Breeding rights, though informal, were politically sensitive. An outsider bringing in a bull without notice might offend local families or upset the manure market balance. In some cases, domain lords issued breeding permits or encouraged superior bulls through incentives, grain, tools, or tax reductions. The result was regionally distinct cattle cultures, all quietly shaped by the state's unseen hand. In many homes, cows lived beneath the same roof as people, separated by a wooden partition, their warmth rising through the floor in winter. Children fed them in the morning. Grandmothers watched for signs of illness. Their presence was a constant, silent rhythm. They were not sacred, but neither were they forgotten. More than property, less than kin, they existed in the middle space where life and livelihood met. When a cow died, it was removed with quiet respect. Sometimes a brief prayer was offered. Sometimes only a note in the ledger. Died in frost, year of the fire ox. The body might be buried, burned, or repurposed, but the space it left behind, in the stall and in the page, was always noticed. As autumn comes again to a rural village, the inspector unrolls a worn scroll. He squints. The kanji for birth is inked beside a name he remembers. He makes a stroke, a tiny cross, another life marked, another cycle complete. He sighs not unhappily. The cow has calved. The count continues. And perhaps it's worth asking, in a world that moves faster with each passing century, what have we lost by forgetting how to count with care? It is the final decades of the Edo period. Japan, still largely closed to the outside world, hums with rhythms that have gone unchanged for centuries. The cow still trudges through muddy furrows. The ink still dries on neat paper ledgers. But a change is coming, slow at first, then sudden. This final section traces how the seemingly timeless art of counting cows faced modern pressures, how the ledger-bound system began to waver, and how the simple act of recording hoofbeats on paper found itself displaced by a world of steam, steel, and meat. And yet, even as the era ends, something quiet and human endures beneath the folds of the old ledgers. Something that whispers not of numbers, but of connection. As population pressures grew in the early 1800s, so too did the demands placed on Japan's agricultural system. In many provinces, land had already been intensely cultivated. Villages expanded into forested slopes and marginal terrain. With more mouths to feed, the stakes of every harvest grew. But so did the fragility. Bad weather, insect infestations, or minor administrative errors could now tip an entire region into crisis. And cows, those sturdy engines of the field, became both more valuable and more vulnerable. When herds fell ill, it meant delayed plowing, fewer carts, and the loss of vital manure. When pastureland was overused, disputes flared over which cows could graze and when. The old agreements, once upheld with a handshake or a shared meal, began to fray. Village headmen found their ledgers crowded with annotations. Calf lost to river flood, suspected theft of brown heifer. Grazing suspended pending water dispute. The simple art of counting had become complicated by the needs of a system under strain. Meanwhile, beyond Japan's shores, a storm was gathering. Western ships were appearing off the coasts. Dutch traders in Nagasaki quietly reported back to Edo with growing urgency. Technologies, telegraphs, trains, rifles, waited just over the horizon. And among the less noticed changes, a new word began to surface in hushed conversations. Beef. Foreigners, it was said, ate cows, not as metaphor or medicine, but as food. To them, cows were not companions of the plow, but walking meals. This was deeply alien to Japanese sensibilities. For centuries, Buddhist teachings, along with official prohibitions, had kept meat consumption taboo, especially from four-legged animals. While wild boar and fowl were eaten discreetly in some regions, the cow remained sacred by absence. Still, curiosity began to stir, and with it, anxiety. Would this foreign hunger reshape the meaning of the animal so carefully counted for generations? By the 1850s, pressure on the Tokugawa shogunate had become unbearable. Famines, rural unrest, and the arrival of Commodore Perry's black ships in 1853 brought the long Edo peace to a slow and cracking end. Though the official fall of the Tokugawa would come in 1868, the decade leading up to it was full of quiet unravelings. Cattle counts were among the overlooked casualties. Inspectors, once dispatched annually, now traveled less frequently or not at all. Ledgers, once diligently copied and stored, became patchy, interrupted by regional unrest. Disputes over grazing land intensified as some villages attempted to privatize communal pastures ahead of feared land reforms. In response to the growing influence of Western ideas, some progressive daimyo began experimenting with new cattle breeds, larger animals, meant not for plowing but for meat and dairy. These animals were raised quietly, sometimes under the pretext of study. The ledgers adapted uneasily. In the margins of a ledger from Satsuma domain, a scribe notes in 1864, 2 bulls, foreign, kept at edge of grazing field, taller, loud, not used for plowing. The tone is careful, observational, but the meaning is clear. Change has arrived, and then, quite suddenly, it ends. By the time the Meiji Restoration begins in 1868, the Ushicho is no longer a living document. The cow, once a symbol of harmony between land and labor, now faces a different fate. Railroads are built. Cities expand. Meat enters the diet. The government promotes civilization and enlightenment, urging people to adopt Western customs, including the eating of beef, once taboo. In 1872, the Meiji Emperor himself publicly consumes beef, sending a cultural shockwave through the country. Within years, cattle are reclassified, not only as agricultural assets, but as sources of meat and milk. The brush is replaced by the stamp, the ledger by the tax register. The cow, once wrapped in straw and silence, now stands in butcher stalls, served in Western-style cafes in Tokyo. 1,000 years of hoofprints fade beneath cobblestones. Yet the old records are not all lost. In temple storerooms and rural archives, some ledgers survive. Bound in paper, ink still legible, names of cows and their keepers intact. They are studied now by historians and archivists, sometimes even descendants of the families who once cared for the cows listed within. And in some villages, the language of the cow lives on in idioms, place names, and seasonal festivals. A spring field called Ushinohara, Cow Meadow. A path known as Kurodo, the way of the black cow. Old sayings like, count the cows before you count the rice, reminding children of the quiet groundwork beneath all prosperity. So now, in the hush of evening, imagine the last cow of the Edo era walking home across a misty field. A child follows, lantern swinging. Behind them, the ink dries on a final page. No one applauds. No one writes it down. But somewhere in that slow, steady rhythm of hooves lies a forgotten form of wisdom. If peace was measured not by proclamations, but by plows, if stability came not from generals, but from careful scribes and gentle animals, then perhaps the most reliable stewards of the Tokugawa peace were not men with swords, but those who counted cows. You are walking beside the Nile. It is not the Nile of cruise ships and tourist photos, but the Nile of 3,000 years ago, a world of slow-moving water, reed boats, and distant cries of herons. The sun is warm but not harsh. Papyrus rustles underfoot. And just up the riverbank, beneath the columns of a provincial administrative house, a man sits hunched over a wooden tablet. He is not a priest or a warrior. He is a scribe of taxes, and he is calculating the grain yield of 3 adjacent plots in Wayzat, modern-day Thebes. His tools are simple: a reed brush, a smooth palette of ochre and black ink, and a quiet sense of certainty. He will record the harvest weight, compare it to past years, and, most importantly, determine what the farmer must now hand over to the state. This is not a story of pyramids or pharaohs. This is the quieter machinery of ancient Egypt, the careful administration of daily life, where lentils, fish, beer, and even beeswax were taxed with precision. A civilization famed for eternity also specialized in bureaucracy, and it kept remarkably good records. To understand Egyptian taxation, you must first understand the Nile. Each year, the river flooded, rising with monsoon rains from Central Africa. This inundation, called Ake, deposited rich silt along the floodplains, making agriculture not only possible but predictable. As the waters receded, farmers planted wheat, barley, flax, and vegetables. The government, watching from its administrative centers, waited. Egypt's entire calendar, and by extension its tax system, was built around the Nile cycles. The agricultural year was divided into 3 seasons. Ake, inundation, June, October, fields under water, planting period. Parate, growing, October, February, crop sown, irrigated, tended. Shimu, harvest, February, June, taxes due, fields inspected, storage tracked. This regularity allowed the pharaoh's administrators to develop what may have been the world's first large-scale tax system based on agricultural output. And it began not with coin, but with barley, beans, garlic, and geese. The scribe was the backbone of the system. Not just literate but numerate, observant, and trained to spot fraud. Scribes visited fields at harvest. Sometimes they worked alone, but often in small teams, accompanied by surveyors, harpagonaptai, and local elders. They assessed crop volume, livestock headcounts, and the condition of irrigation dikes. They didn't weigh or count everything. Instead, they used standardized volume containers, often basket-shaped measuring tools, and recorded results in units like the hecate, approximately 4.8 liters. Grain was measured not by weight, but by how many hecats filled a state basket. Tax quotas were not equal. They varied based on region, past yield, and social status. A temple granary might owe hundreds of sacks. A small tenant farmer only a few. Still, everyone owed something. Even those who lived by fishing or beekeeping had quotas. Some paid in dried fish, honeycombs, or woven linen. We know this not because of speculation, but because of documents, thousands of them. Papyrus scrolls, ostraca, pottery shards used for writing, and inscribed wooden boards have survived across the centuries, many miraculously preserved by Egypt's dry climate. From the Wilbur Papyrus, circa 1145 BCE, for instance, we learn that land was categorized meticulously. Fields of the pharaoh, fields of temples, fields leased to individuals, fields under conditional exemption. Each entry includes the name of the landholder, the acreage, the crop type, and the tax owed, sometimes with notes like 3 donkeys used or irrigation failed, tax delayed. There is a rhythm to the entries. Calm, precise, often boring. But beneath the neat columns of ink lies a world of effort, survival, and negotiation. Unlike later monetary economies, Egypt's taxes were collected in goods, not coins. The state maintained vast granaries and storehouses, where collected produce was stored and redistributed to temples, armies, public workers, and the royal household. Grain was most common, barley and emmer wheat. Beer was sometimes accepted, measured in jars. Cloth, often linen, was counted by the cubit. Fish, dates, and onions were regionally prominent. Honey and wax had ceremonial as well as economic value. Everything had its rate. In many cases, what was taxed most wasn't the farmer, but the land itself. The state claimed partial ownership of all arable territory, and tenancy involved obligation. Even temples paid taxes, though many enjoyed partial exemptions, depending on the pharaoh's favor and the influence of the priesthood. It was not a perfect system. Farmers developed many ways to evade or negotiate their dues. Underreporting yields, claiming flood damage, drought, or pestilence, bribing inspectors, offering a basket of fresh fish or a crafted amulet, swapping land, rotating plots between family members to avoid detection, misleading measurements, using shallow baskets or mixing grain with chaff. Some records from Deir el-Medina, a village of artisans who worked on royal tombs, show complaints about harsh collectors who take more than is owed or arrive without notice. In Thebes, one scribe recorded that a farmer cried and tore his garment, offering only a half ration of beer as payment for that year's levy. The official noted, "Coolie, reconsidered, postponed until flood season." These were not rebellions, but micronegotiations, tiny acts of agency within a highly ordered world. Picture a mid-sized office in a provincial capital. Reeds lean in the wind outside. Inside, scribes sit on mats, knees tucked, ink palettes arranged in trays. Shelves, wooden, crude, hold papyrus rolls labeled with date and nome, district. A junior clerk reads aloud, "In the year 9 of the reign of Amenhotep." Another scribe mutters about smudged ink. A third sharpens a reed with a flint blade. Outside, a farmer waits with a basket of lentils and a polite expression. He has walked all morning to reach the office. He will return with a receipt, pressed in clay, then written on a palm fiber strip. No drama, no shouting, just a quiet transaction in the machinery of state. This too was Egypt. As evening falls over the Nile Valley, the light fades from the columns. A scribe stretches his fingers. The farmer departs. The ink dries. Tomorrow there will be more baskets, more names, more hecats. But for now, silence. And perhaps one might wonder, when a civilization lasts 3,000 years, is its strength in its kings, or in its clerks? The sun rises again over the Nile floodplain. The river, once swollen with summer rains, now retreats into its narrow bed. Across the countryside, the mud-brown fields begin to dry, firming underfoot. Farmers emerge from homes built of mud brick and reed, and the season of harvest begins. But alongside the physical work of cutting barley and threshing wheat, another process is already in motion, the state's preparation to collect. In this section, we look more deeply into what happened after the taxes were calculated, how produce was stored, how temple economies blended with bureaucracy, and how the granary, not the palace, became the true engine of ancient Egyptian survival. Let us return to the grain. In ancient Egypt, storage was power. Without refrigeration, and in a land with limited rainfall and no forests to speak of, keeping food usable over time required both planning and architectural innovation. The Egyptians developed granaries, cone-shaped or rectangular buildings made of thick mud brick, often raised on platforms with narrow slits for air circulation. These structures preserved grain, beans, lentils, onions, and sometimes even dried dates or figs. Each granary was overseen by a keeper, or Imwiper-hetep, literally, he who is in charge of the offerings. His job wasn't just to keep rats out. He ensured accurate entry and removal logs, inspection of grain quality, dampness, infestation, weight, rotation of older stock before newer stock, coordination with scribes and temple priests. In some regions, these granaries were attached to temples or regional tax offices. In others, they stood in state-controlled storeyard complexes, often with small administrative quarters for record-keeping. Without banks or vaults, grain was currency, and these buildings were the national vaults. In modern minds, temples might be sacred, separate from state. But in ancient Egypt, temples were often economic institutions as much as religious ones. Major temples, such as those at Karnak, Memphis, or Abydos, owned vast tracts of farmland, herds of livestock, and hundreds, sometimes thousands, of workers. These temples were both landowners and tax recipients, empowered by royal decree to collect agricultural dues from tenant farmers and dependent laborers. The gods, after all, needed offerings. A portion of every harvest was due to the divine household. Grain and beer for Ammonius, geese and linen for Osiris, honey, myrrh, and fruit for Hathor. But in practice, the grain rarely went to altars. It fed temple staff, funded building projects, and served as exchangeable surplus, traded or loaned during years of famine. The temple scribes maintained duplicate ledgers to those kept by the state, and sometimes tension arose between temple and civil administrators over how much land belonged to whom, or whether a field was exempt under sacred obligation. The average farmer, caught between the temple's claim and the state's, could find himself delivering to both, quietly, grudgingly, without recourse. Despite the system's reputation for rigidity, The ancient Egyptian tax system included mechanisms for delay and negotiation, especially when the Nile flood was poor or local pests devoured crops. In some years, the pharaoh would issue a general tax forgiveness decree, inscribed in stone on temple walls or administrative buildings. These weren't acts of mercy so much as calculated strategies to preserve loyalty and prevent unrest. In Thebes, one such decree during the reign of Ramesses III, circa 1180 BCE, reads, "Let those whose fields gave little this year be spared the burden, for the river has shown a lean heart." Elsewhere, relief came not in the form of cancellation, but loans. The state or temple might grant a farmer seed grain for the next season, recorded in a contract on papyrus or ostraca. Repayment terms were set, sometimes with interest in the form of surplus produce or labor. Failure to repay didn't lead to imprisonment, but could result in loss of land rights or assignment of one's son to temple service for a period of years. We catch glimpses of how people felt about taxes in the margins of documents, the stray words of complaint, or the humor buried in satire. One ostracon from Deir el-Medina, home to the workers who built the tombs of the Valley of the Kings, contains a sketch of a man bent under a load of grain, with a caption reading, "His harvest fills the bags of others." A weary joke, to be sure, but one that suggests both awareness and resignation. Scribes, too, had their burdens. Their records had to be unassailably neat, even under pressure. Some ostraca contained practice lines, showing failed attempts at straight entries, corrected kanji, or ink blots hastily smudged. Mistakes were serious. A mismatched count could lead to double collection, administrative confusion, or official suspicion. Scribes might be called to testify to explain discrepancies. Still, there was pride. To be a tax scribe was to hold power, even if wielded with a brush instead of a blade. In addition to produce, Egypt taxed livestock, especially cattle, sheep, and donkeys. Census records, some surviving from the Ramesside period, indicate head counts by village, updated annually, registration of birth, death, and sale, branding or earmarking to avoid misreporting. Officials traveled during Shimu, the dry season, recording animal counts as part of the broader harvest tax cycle. Owners were charged per head, often in kind, a percentage of the animal's value, paid in goods. Animals were not sacred in these ledgers. They were assets, and every asset had a column. Behind every entry, every hecate, every sack of lentils, stood the labor of movement. Farmers hauling goods on reed sledges, women processing grain into flour and beer for offerings, porters unloading at granary platforms, brushing sand from baskets, scribes reading aloud long inventories, pausing to sip cool water from clay pots. None of these people are named, yet they sustained an empire. The pharaoh sat in a gilded chair, but the system of taxation sat on a stool of palm wood, balanced carefully on the shoulders of scribes, farmers, and those who measured onions at dusk. In training, young scribes recited oaths. "I will measure with a steady hand. I will not favor the loud man over the quiet. What is due, I will write. What is unjust, I will leave blank." These weren't always honored, but the fact that they existed tells us how seriously the task was taken. To record was to rule, but to rule well meant knowing what could not be harvested twice. As the sun slants low over the Nile and the harvest season nears its end, a granary keeper makes one final check. The baskets are full. The scrolls are stored. The flood will come again. But for now, the numbers rest. And so one might ask, the long shadow of the new kingdom is beginning to fade. Across the Nile Valley, temples still gleam with painted hieroglyphs, and priests chant beneath pylons carved with the names of kings. But the Egypt of towering dynasties of Seti, Ramses, and Hatshepsut is slowly yielding to new rhythms. Leaner floods, changing dynasties, and external pressures that test even the steadiest ledgers. And yet, taxation continues. For in this final chapter of Egypt's ancient system, the work of counting, collecting, and recording doesn't disappear. It adapts, thins, fragments, and it leaves behind a final layer of inked marks that speak, softly, of continuity in the face of collapse. Beginning around 900 BCE, Egypt entered what scholars call the Third Intermediate Period, an era marked by fragmented rule, regional dynasties, and occasional invasions. The great unified state that once taxed from Elephantine to the Delta splintered into local kingdoms, each with its own scribes and temple economies. The land still flooded. Farmers still planted and harvested. But the neat hierarchies of tax assessment began to break down. In some districts, temples took on increased roles, not only in collecting dues but in adjudicating disputes and issuing receipts. Elsewhere, noble families began to assert ownership over fields and tenants, collecting grain for their own storehouses, sometimes under royal authority, sometimes not. And still the ledgers were kept, even if messier, thinner, more local. Under the Libyan-descended rulers of the 22nd and 23rd dynasties, c. 945 to 728 BCE, administrative systems were partially restored. Taxation became part of elite household management. Family-led scribes kept tabs on village output, submitting summaries to regional governors. Interestingly, this period shows a rise in family granary records, small ledgers kept by landholding households that recorded dues paid to temples, distributions to laborers, and stock kept for seed. Later, under the Kushite dynasty, 25th dynasty, c. 744 to 656 BCE, the Nubian rulers embraced traditional Egyptian bureaucracy. They supported temple authority, restructured taxation to reduce corruption, and issued decrees from Thebes and Napata reaffirming state control over land, produce, and livestock. One stele from this period records a grain delivery system for the god Ammonius temple, itemizing 280 sacks of emmer wheat from 7 villages, 120 jars of beer from the temple of Khonsu, 36 bundles of papyrus reeds for wrapping grain jars. It's a reminder that even amid dynastic change, the structures of accountability endured. The gods still ate symbolically, and the scribes still wrote. By the 6th century BCE, during Egypt's late period, the influence of foreign powers began to grow, especially with the arrival of the Persian Empire under Cambyses II in 525 BCE. With the Persians came new ideas, imperial roads, cavalry, and most importantly for our story, coined money. Until this point, Egypt had remained a kind of barter economy. Grain, cloth, oil, and livestock had served as both goods and currency. But under Persian rule, coinage, initially from Asia Minor, began to enter Egypt's marketplaces, slowly reshaping the way taxes were assessed and paid. We don't know exactly how quickly this transition occurred. In all likelihood, taxation in kind persisted among rural villages, while coins were used for tribute, official salaries, and long-distance trade. But the scribes began to notice. In the margins of some ledgers from this period, symbols appear not of Hecate baskets but of silver weights and foreign numerals. A system thousands of years old was beginning to feel the edges of its own end. Many tax records from this period are fragmentary. The Nile floods still came, but not always reliably. Crops failed more frequently. In some regions, the scribal schools that once trained generations of administrators faltered under economic or political strain. Where once tax records were kept in multiple copies, redundancy began to fade. Papyrus scrolls were reused. Some scribes wrote on limestone flakes, their curves and corners dictating awkward margins. Others recorded only in memory, passing notes from father to son. In this climate, fraud became easier. Temples claimed exemptions retroactively. Landowners withheld dues. Officials fabricated deliveries. Still, some scribes continued to work with the same quiet diligence. One shard from Saqqara contains a simple line, 4 sacks of barley, measured in the presence of Ra. There's no flourish, just a record, just a mark, as if to say, I was here, I counted. As before, much of this system depended on labor that went unnamed. The woman who wove linen for offering, the child who swept the granary floor, the porter who heaved sacks under a summer sun, the assistant scribe who ground pigment and sharpened reed pens. They are not listed, but their work lives in the even spacing of ink lines, the smudge where a finger braced a tablet, The worn corner of a docket passed through too many hands. For every monument to a pharaoh, there were 100 nameless tallies carved, brushed, or scratched on everyday materials. Proof that a society so vast depended, quietly, on those who counted its harvest. And so the last pages were filled. By the time of Alexander the Great's conquest of Egypt in 332 BCE, the old tax systems had already shifted. Under the Ptolemies, they would be transformed again: Greek scribes, Hellenistic accounting, silver coinage, and a different rhythm of rule. But the ancient patterns were never entirely erased. Some persisted as habits, others as superstitions, and still others as structures folded into newer systems. A piece of papyrus, worn but legible, might still have said, "Measured in the 3rd year of drought. Reduced by decree of the vizier. Stored in granary of the temple of Mut." And that, too, is Egypt. So now, in the stillness after sunset, imagine the last scribe of an era. He dips his brush one final time. Not for a monument, not for a tomb, but for a field of barley dried and bundled, owed in part to gods and governors. He writes the number. He closes the scroll. And we are left to wonder,